President Andrew Jackson signed a death warrant for 60,000 people on May 28, 1830. He called it the Indian Removal Act. Congress had debated for months, with opponents warning it would bring shame upon the nation, that it violated every treaty the United States had ever signed with the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muscogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. The bill passed the Senate by a margin of just 6 votes. It passed the House by only 5. What followed would become one of the largest forced relocations in human history, a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing that would kill an estimated 15,000 men, women, and children. But what the architects of this policy never anticipated, what would haunt the implementation for years, was that these nations would not go quietly. The act itself was written with careful ambiguity. It authorized the president to negotiate treaties for the exchange of lands, to pay for improvements native peoples had made to their property, to provide support for emigration. The word force appeared nowhere in the text. This was deliberate. Supporters could claim the removals would be voluntary, conducted with the consent of tribal governments. The reality would prove very different. The 5 major nations of the Southeast had built schools, written constitutions, published newspapers, and established courts. The Cherokee had developed their own written language. These were not nomadic peoples who could simply relocate. These were settled nations with farms, businesses, and generational ties to their land, and they had no intention of leaving. The Cherokee Nation did something unprecedented. They sued. Principal Chief John Ross led a legal challenge that reached the highest court in the land, arguing that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee territory. In March 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the Supreme Court's opinion in Worcester v. Georgia. The Cherokee Nation, Marshall wrote, was a distinct political community with territorial boundaries that Georgia had no right to enter. The state's laws had no force within Cherokee lands. It was a complete legal victory. President Jackson ignored it. The executive branch simply refused to enforce the ruling. Georgia continued its seizure of Cherokee property. State officials held lotteries distributing Cherokee farms to white settlers. Gold had been discovered on Cherokee land, and prospectors flooded in under Georgia's protection. The message was clear. The law meant nothing if no one would enforce it. The Supreme Court had spoken, and the president had responded with contempt. John Ross would spend years seeking allies in Congress, filing petitions, and appealing to the American public. He believed that if enough citizens understood what was happening, the government would be forced to honor its own laws. He was wrong. The Choctaw Nation became the first to walk the trail. In the winter of 1831, groups began the journey west under conditions that defied comprehension. One column of several thousand people was caught in a blizzard in Arkansas. They had been promised blankets, food, and transportation. The government contractors responsible for supplies had provided almost nothing. Men and women wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find. Children froze. The elderly collapsed in the snow and were left behind. A Choctaw leader, speaking to a reporter from the Arkansas Gazette, described what he witnessed. He called it a trail of tears and death. Over the next 2 years, approximately 12,000 Choctaw were relocated. An estimated 4,000 died during the journey or shortly after arrival. The contracts to feed and transport the Choctaw had been awarded to private speculators who saw the removal as an opportunity for profit. Federal funds meant for provisions went into their pockets. The pattern would repeat with every nation that followed. Government officials knew the contractors were corrupt. They did nothing. The deaths continued. By 1835, the Cherokee had resisted removal for 5 years through every legal means available. Then a small faction made a decision that would fracture the nation. Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and a group known as the Treaty Party traveled to Washington without authorization from the Cherokee government. They signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi River in exchange for $5 million and territory in the West. The Cherokee Constitution made selling tribal land without consent a capital offense. Major Ridge knew this when he signed. He reportedly said he had signed his own death warrant. John Ross gathered over 15,000 signatures protesting the treaty. He submitted them to Congress. The Senate ratified the treaty anyway, by a single vote. The Cherokee now had 2 years to leave their homeland voluntarily. After that, they would be removed by force. Ross continued to fight, believing until the very end that the government would not actually carry out mass expulsion. In the spring of 1838, 7,000 U.S. Army troops under General Winfield Scott arrived in Cherokee territory. They came with bayonets. Not everyone walked the trail. The Seminole chose war. When removal orders came, a leader named Osceola organized resistance in the Florida swamps, terrain so difficult that conventional military tactics became worthless. American soldiers marched into wetlands where Seminole fighters knew every island, every passage, every place to disappear. The Second Seminole War lasted 7 years. It cost the United States over 1,500 soldiers and an estimated $40 million. It became the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. The Army tried everything. They brought in bloodhounds. They captured Osceola under a flag of truce, an act of betrayal that shocked even some American observers. He died in military prison 3 months later. Still, the Seminole fought. When the war finally ended, several hundred Seminole remained in Florida. Never removed, their descendants still there today. They had proven something that the legal strategies could not. Resistance was possible, but the cost was measured in blood. General Winfield Scott issued orders that would define the Cherokee removal. His soldiers swept through the nation in the early summer of 1838, appearing at farms and homes with no warning. Families were given minutes to gather what they could carry. Those who resisted were forced at bayonet point. Soldiers dragged people from dinner tables, from fields, from sickbeds. Within weeks, approximately 16,000 Cherokee had been forced into hastily constructed stockades. The camps became death traps. Overcrowding spread disease with terrifying speed. Dysentery, measles, and whooping cough moved through the imprisoned population. Summer heat made conditions unbearable. The sick lay beside the healthy with no separation. Children died in their mothers' arms. John Ross negotiated permission for the Cherokee to manage their own removal, hoping to reduce the death toll. The government agreed, largely because the Army's management had proven so catastrophic. The Cherokee would organize their own march west. They would bury their own dead along the way. The first groups departed in the summer of 1838, but most of the Cherokee waited until fall, hoping cooler weather would make the journey survivable. It did not. The main removal began in October and continued through the worst winter in memory. Approximately 16,000 people walked over 1,000 miles through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and into Indian Territory. They walked through ice storms. They walked when the rivers froze and when the roads turned to mud. They walked past towns where residents came out to watch them pass. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died during the removal. That is 1 in 4. They died of pneumonia, of exposure, of exhaustion. They died of heartbreak. Elders who had lived their entire lives on ancestral land simply stopped walking and lay down in the snow. Mothers carried children who grew still in their arms. The soldiers kept the columns moving. There were schedules to maintain. Those who could not keep pace were left where they fell. The survivors called it Nuna Dole Suni, the trail where they cried. The survivors reached Indian Territory to find almost nothing waiting for them. The promised supplies were inadequate. The land was unfamiliar. Many who had survived the march died in the months that followed, weakened beyond recovery. The trauma of the journey gave way to the trauma of rebuilding everything from nothing in a place they had never wanted to be. And then the killings began. On June 22, 1839, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by Cherokee who held them responsible for the Treaty of New Echota. The executions followed Cherokee law, which made unauthorized sale of tribal land punishable by death. The nation that had been fractured by removal now faced internal warfare that would last for years. The architects of the treaty had predicted as much. They had signed anyway, believing removal was inevitable, that cooperation might at least preserve something. They were wrong about what could be preserved. Some wounds do not heal. The Trail of Tears was not a natural disaster. It was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was a series of deliberate choices made by named individuals who understood the consequences of their actions. Andrew Jackson chose to ignore the Supreme Court. Congress chose to ratify a fraudulent treaty. Contractors chose profit over human life. Soldiers chose to follow orders. 60,000 people were forced from their homes. 15,000 died. The nations that survived rebuilt themselves in exile, maintaining their governments, their languages, their identities against deliberate efforts to erase them. They are still here. The trail they walked is still marked on maps, a scar across the American landscape that refuses to fade, that insists we remember what was done and who chose to do it.